Hi there, this is the video for the Flower Dissection Lab. The purpose of this lab is for you to explore the structure of a flower and to identify the parts in it that are involved in sexual reproduction, including how each of those parts is involved in reproduction. So we'll get started with this. I'll start with the basics that flowers are organs for sexual reproduction by, what are called flowering plants, also called angiosperms. Flowers have look very different from one flower to another, but actually one thing they do have is they actually have a lot in common. Most flowers, though not all of them, have both male and female parts. The male and female parts, again, they're shaped differently, and the petals are different, and the flower sizes are different, colors are different, but the male and female parts, when they're present, have names that I'd like you to become a little more familiar with. In general, for a flowering plant, for a flower, the female parts are going to be in the middle. The male parts are immediately next to it on the side, and around the edge of the plant there are these structures to attract pollinators, that is to say, petals. These are the things that give plants, that give flowers their special colors. Here we see a kind of a diagram of not necessarily what every flower looks like, but that shows the different parts you can expect to find in a flower. In the middle, we have a structure called the style. So the style, this is the female reproductive part. It has the following parts. It has an ovule, or has an ovary, which is where the seeds are, the eggs. It has a kind of a pillar structure right down the middle here. And then at the top, it has this thing called the stigma. And the stigma is a little bit sticky, and that's what receives the pollen. The male structures here on the side, or highlighted here in black, are called stamens. The stamen is what, on the tip of the stamen, on the anther of the stamen, secretes pollen, or produces pollen. The pollen is the male reproductive cell. When the male reproductive cells with the pollen gets to the stigma of a different flower of the same species, the pollen grains can break open, and some of the male reproductive cells, basically plant sperm, can make their way down this tube right here and into the ovary and fertilize these ovules. That process, where the ovules get fertilized by the sperm from the pollen, is the act of sexual reproduction in flowering plants. That's what flowers are for. It's for plants to of the same species to trade their genes back and forth through pollination. So what you're going to look at today is you're going to find a flower somewhere in nature, and we'll talk a bit about that, and you're going to use that flower to find some of these structures. You're not going to find a flower that looks exactly like this. One flower, flowers look different from each other. There's a lot of variation in the structures of flowers, but you're going to find some of these parts, hopefully. What I'm going to do today is to show you what I did to find a flower to do this lab myself. I'm going to show you what I think is a good product to make as part of doing this lab, and how to go about doing that yourself. I'm a big believer in, for my own teaching, in getting people to pay close attention to what they see in front of them. Take careful observations. Now, when you're taking careful observations, you want to be thinking, oh, what is my question? What am I interested in? Here, you're interested in the structures of a flower, and you want your observations to be accurate. You want them to be specific. You want them to be targeted to your question. You want them to be detailed. What I'm suggesting that you guys do here as part of your lab, your teachers will maybe say something different, is to start by doing, once you have your flower, to draw it from the front and from the side. I'm going to show you that. and then to start taking it apart, to dissect the flower and to look at the structures inside to see if you can find those male and female reproductive parts. So here's what I did when I did this myself. First of all, materials that I got for it. You're going to need, at least if you're going to do the drawing part, obviously you're going to need some pencil crayons. As you're going to see here, I got this nice little flower right here. I'll show it to you in a sec. Pick some of these parts for it. A little magnifying glass is useful if you don't have a microscope. You'll need a knife to cut the flower apart, and of course you'll need this handout. Now, where do you go to get your flower? Well, first of all, I guess the first question is, when do you go? And the answer to that question is probably going to be spring, summer, early fall. This would be a difficult lab to do in the winter unless you're living somewhere that's often really warm. Now, to be more detailed about it, where do you go? Well, if you know where someone has a garden with flowers in it, that's a good spot. You might have a hard time finding flowers in a deep forest, but most places where there are plants, where there are flowering plants in the right time of the year, you're going to locate flowers. I do want to tell you a little bit about what makes a good flower for this lab and what makes a not so good flower for this lab. So let's start with a good flower. So this here is a lily. Now, I didn't use this lily for the lab because it's a really nice flower. I didn't want to destroy it. But it would be a great flower to do this lab with. For starters, it's really big. It helps to have a flower that's really large, so that way you'll have a much easier time finding those male and female reproductive parts, and it's a lot more fun to look at, a lot more fun to draw. So that would be great. Something would also be great here would be, even though this is a little bit smaller, this is a fuchsia right here, you still have all the parts. You've got your petals, well, you got your sepals, you got petals. These are the male reproductive parts sticking out here. The female reproductive parts are hidden behind all that. Fuchsia will be great as well. Again, one flower is different from the next, but at the same time, we still do see all those reproductive parts. Here, as you're going to see, we have a kind of a ring here of stamens. The yellow parts are the anthers. That's where the pollen is. In the middle are the female reproductive parts, and surrounding that are the petals. All flowering plants have this basic design, and this would be a good flower to use as well, although it's not the one that I used. Let's look at a couple that you don't really want to use. Well, here's one I found in a waste field near where we live. It would be okay, except the flowers are extremely small. This here is not a single flower. This is probably hundreds of tiny flowers. That would be very hard to do a lab activity on if you need to see them large enough to draw. Another one I recommend you not do would be clover. Clover is really super common in lawns, but because of the shape of the clover flower, it's kind of hard to do this lab following the directions for clover. That things are not going to be seen to be located in the same spots as you would expect them to be based on the diagram that you're given. Also, the flowers of clover are really small. Here's one you really don't want to get tricked by. This looks like dandelion, and dandelion falls in the same group. They're called ray flowers. Dandelions and flowers that look like them are called ray flowers. Daisies are the same way, or composite flowers. They're actually not single flowers. They're actually groups of flowers clustered close together. This makes ray flowers, the shape of the ray flower in comparison with the diagram in the handout, is really different. It will be really difficult to do this lab using a dandelion as your model. Are all the parts there? Yes. The male reproductive parts are there in a dandelion as well as the female parts. Everything's there, but it's much smaller than you would expect, and it's harder to work with. So I wouldn't use a dandelion for this lab. You also do find weird things when you're looking in a flower garden. There's a few things around. Here's a plant I wouldn't use. What's wrong here? Well, we got petals, but doesn't seem to be a whole lot going on in the middle. Either this flower hasn't matured, or maybe it doesn't even make those sexual parts, because maybe it's just a garden variety that doesn't do that. I don't know. I wouldn't use this for that lab. Now, you don't have to have a garden or access to a garden to do this lab. Quite the opposite. I went to a waste field behind where I live, and I had no problems finding flowers that are just fine for this lab. Flowers where you can see the male parts, the stamens. You can see the female part, the pistil is the name for the female part, not the style, it's the pistil. And they're all really obvious right in front of you. Buttercups are an example. Here we see a nice bumblebee hanging around on this buttercup, doing some pollinating. These would be perfectly fine for doing the lab activity. You don't need a garden to do this lab. You just need it to be the right time of year and to go with the right equipment. So I could go through some more examples, but not really crucially necessary to do that. Let's go back, however, to the materials. All the materials you see here, this one right here, the knife, or something like it, maybe even a pair of scissors, that's the one thing I would bring with me going outside. Although it certainly couldn't hurt to bring your phone to take some photos. Now, what I did when I did this lab activity is I didn't want to cut my really nice plants apart, like the nice lilies. I was like, it's not my garden. I found some flowers where there are lots of them, and there are these pond weeds right here. The yellow guys right here. It's called bog bean. Doesn't matter what it's called. All that matters is that it's another typical flower with all of those parts like you see in the diagram in the handout. So I found that plant and I brought it inside. I got my colors together and I made some black and white drawings. That's the way I recommend doing this. You know, it's not up to me really in terms of if you do the drawings at all with this handout, with this activity. It's not really up for me to tell you how to draw. The only piece of advice I'll give you is if you want to draw something, don't go to it with any kind of preconceptions about what it should look like. Don't draw the flower that's in your head. Look at the flower that's in front of you and make lines that you think match with what the flower looks like. To me, drawing is as simple as that. It's not easy. My drawings aren't perfect, but it's a simple thing to look at what you see and to put it to paper. And that's what I've done right here. I made drawings that I figured were good enough for this lab activity, and then I went and colored them in. If you look here, the second page there, this is the bottom part of that handout. So what I did after I colored in the first page, I went and I cut my flower apart. I cut it apart. I removed some of the petals, as you can see right here. I also removed a male reproductive part, one of the stamens. Then I cut out the pistil, the female reproductive part. Again, the pistil has got these three different parts to it. The ovary, where the seeds are, the style, which is that long, thin part of the pistil, and then the stigma at the tip that receives the pollen. Part of this activity is to take a knife and to cut from the top of the pistil down to the very bottom and to cut the pistil into two identical halves. That's what it looked like. When I looked close at it through my magnifying glass, I could see the little ovules. I consider this really to be a crucial part of my result for this lab activity. The other part, I guess I also want to show you something. And that's an even better look at those reproductive parts. Let's rotate this bad boy. There we are. So I use my my camera phone, and I cut off one of those male parts. So this is a stamen for the bog bean. Different stamens look different. Some are longer, some are shorter, but they've all got the same basic parts. They got a filament, that's the long, thin part of it, and the tip, they have an anther. That's where the pollen gets made. Here, the stamen for a bog bean happens to be really short and looks a little bit like a shovel, I guess, with a weird curved tip. So that's the stamen for the bog bean, and I have a picture of it, as you can see right here through the magnifying glass. How about the female parts? Because that stamen is the male parts. Well, what I did here is I did the same thing a bit later, actually. Cut it down the middle, and this is actually a pretty awesome picture. What you can see here is I've bisected the entire pistil, the female part, and when you break it open properly and are careful with it, look at what we have here. Right? All there in the middle, those are the ovules. If they had been fertilized by the male reproductive cells, the male sex cells from the pollen, these little ovules in the ovary would have become seeds for the bog bean. The other part of this lab, at least when I do it with my students, is I'm like, okay, now describe your flower with reference to the different structures of a flower in general. And here we go. So here are all those parts after I've cut them off. The ovule with the and here are the petals down here. There's some of the male parts right there. The bog bean has, by my count, 5 sepals. Those are the green sort of spiky things, although the sepals on your plant might look totally different. In fact, your flower might not even have sepals. It has 5 petals. There they are at the bottom. If you look at the, having cut away the petals, if you look at the stamens in the middle, it also has 5 stamens. Those are 5 of the male plant parts. Each stamen has 1 anther, so 5 in total, and 5 filaments. As for the female parts, though, there is only 1 pistil, 1 stigma, 1 style, and 1 ovary. And that is a description of the flowering parts, plant parts for the bog bean. I didn't have time to actually count out every ovule. I'm just saying there's about 50 of them. The other part of this lab, of course, is your teacher. When you do that with your teacher, they're probably going to have you answer some questions, maybe about the pollen or about the ecological needs of the plant, or just about sexual reproduction in plants, or maybe about asexual reproduction in plants. There's a lot of different ways that the result of this lab activity can be spun, but however you do it, I hope that you enjoy it.